Hello and welcome back to Crew Parley, the reverse variant of Parley that we normally do in this channel. Instead of you paying for the Parley tier and submitting a prompt, and then I make a video about it, I give you all a prompt, and folks at the lower $5 tier can submit responses. I do a video once a month talking about those responses. So my prompt for August 2024 was basically about build systems synergizing with gameplay. What type of gameplay fits well with making builds? Builds, and the systems that allow for them, I said in the prompt, are generally not an all-encompassing part of a game. A first-person shooter, for example, is often mostly or entirely a first-person game and is almost entirely shooting, whereas you might think of build systems as a more secondary element of a game's design. So, what sort of surrounding gameplay loop or format do you think has a lot of synergy with making builds? What type of gameplay loop do you think a build system supports very well? Or simply, what kinds of games do you just personally enjoy making builds in, and why? Pretty straightforward. And we got some responses. So just to clarify my example a little bit more, you could think of it another way, like a first-person shooter. As a genre, if you want to call it that, it's sort of not a genre, but a format of game. As a piece of the game's structure, making the game first person and a shooter is pretty narrow. You know, there's a decently small number of things relative to all the things that could be happening in a game that are accessible to the player. It will be hard then for a build system to make being first person and playing a shooter feel like all that different, necessarily. You can pick different guns, certainly. That's a common approach. Cyberpunk 2077 comes to mind for me. In Cyberpunk, before they rebalanced the trees, by the way, this was like launch Cyberpunk, so don't freak out if this doesn't sound correct to Cyberpunk that you played. You know, there were things like hacking and melee that kind of change how you view the world or engage, but a majority of the rest of the talents were essentially just different ways to make different guns more powerful. And so it's, you know, you're still going to be first-person shooting. The experience isn't that different. And I don't really like the idea, actually, that you sort of want those perks, or a lot of categories of weapon aren't that good feeling. You know, there's this kind of tricky thing in build systems where you want to make it feel like the options are options, rather than just, if I want to use a shotgun, it is idiocy to not use this perk that makes shotguns good, basically. Obviously, that's subjective, but I do think that there's a way to add objectivity to it so that more players will feel like, you know, this is fine and these are just choices. And that way, in my opinion, is to do something more with the idea that build systems are a secondary loop. They're not the primary thing the player's doing all the time, but they're going to hook into it maybe if the game is, you know, a good build system game. So stuff like hacking and melee. Now, I didn't love hacking or melee in Cyberpunk 2077, but they did affect the experience. I looked at the world differently. I experienced the game differently while continuing to play more or less a first-person shooter. And I think that's why they were at least somewhat successful in terms of build options. In terms of gameplay, meh, but that's what we're here to talk about. There isn't any particular reason that it feels like a first-person shooting game fits or wants build systems in it, if that makes sense. And so what did you folks come up with in terms of stuff that does kind of ask for that a bit more? A fairly straightforward one to start off. iPatchNotes says, I think lightly randomized arcade-like experiences, roguelikes if you like, can lend themselves to feeling build-focused by leaving creative gaps in the UI. Hades, the first one, does this quite prominently by having 5 open diamonds on the side of the screen representing the 5 core boon slots on the player's left. On the other hand, non-core boons tend to infinitely flow to the right. The player is definitely not being encouraged to fill up the UI, a trait shared with similar games Nova Drift and Risk of Rain 2. Right, obviously that piece of design just visually is encouraging you to have like a lot of boons and not leaving a slot kind of unfilled, maybe. Now, Hades is tricky about this. iPatchNotes continues, slots are meant to be filled, is somewhat of a dangerous mindset, though. To use Hades 1 as an example again, the core boon slots on the side, really noticeable looking empty slots, are the primary prerequisites to duo boons, and deliberately not taking them leads to certain forms of increased agency. Duo boons can be powerful, but so can carefully controlling the boon pool, as the run can only support so many. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great starting point where when games have an obvious gap, it feels like build making would fill that well, right? I mean, that would give you something to kind of put in that gap. But making a build isn't the same as just choosing things on its own. It's not just choices. I'm not here to define what making a build is or isn't to any individual person, just to say that I think that experiences that feel more like making a build and less like just picking things do have more qualities often associated with them. And not every player, not many players perhaps, playing your game will necessarily be interpreting the game as being a build system. If the player sees 4 or 5 open slots, I mean, why not fill them all? Now, there are plenty of logical reasons not to, that have nothing to do with making a build and nothing to do with seeing the open slots. I mean, in Hades, if your attack and your special can be spammed all the time, you simply don't need a boon on one or the other in many cases. You will be busy doing the one that has a boon, and that one is already powerful. It's logically reasonably obvious, I hope that isn't too harsh, that it doesn't necessarily benefit you to fill at every slot if you're just busy doing stuff. The time the player takes performing actions in Hades is one of its best forms of opportunity cost. You kind of have to find a way to put damage in your rotation when you make a build to improve your damage by the most. Let's say you've got an attack that does lightning bolts, every hit, and you get a boon that triggers when you do a lightning bolt attack that does more damage. Pretty straightforward, so you could just use your attack and get the benefit of those boons. If you were to put a boon on your special, well, now it does some other extra thing, but you also lose both boons from your attack and the lightning bolt while you're doing your special. So you kind of balanced out that damage gain. You didn't necessarily gain damage that much unless your special is good in a kind of meaningfully different situation. But talking about Zeus in Hades 1, it's probably not, though. Those boons are pretty versatile. And so that's an interesting point of balancing, but I think many players simply don't think of it that way. Again, it might be obvious from a certain perspective, but from another perspective, I mean, it's your casual entertainment, and the game is showing you empty slots. Ought you not to fill them? And it's more complicated because some of them, there isn't really a drawback to filling this slot, like your call boon in Hades 1. This is a chargeable sort of ultimate style ability that you get from one god. That is in one of those 5 empty slots on the side of the screen, but it is kind of something you can have on top of everything else. You just chart it up, and then when you use it, it's only a few seconds. You're often free to act while you're using it. It just does more damage. That really is damage on top of everything else, a lot of the time. Dash boons are often damage on top of everything else, but your attack, special, to some extent your cast, aren't in the same way, at least not always. And I think that somewhat complicates the system. Furthermore, yes, it's an interesting piece of opportunity cost in Hades that if you open up many gods in your run, you've got a lot of different Olympians and you have boons from each of them. You can get duo boons from many of them as well. This makes what you can get when you get a boon from a god less focused. There are more boons you could get, so you've lost some control. But I think many players simply don't realize that that's the case. I think Hades 1, then, is guilty of having systems that are actually pretty interesting ways to balance the game if you know about them, but the game kind of doesn't look like it's about that, I think, to a lot of people anyway. It's also really hard, which I think tends to make people think they just have to, get good or try harder physically. And so I do find that Hades 1, at least to me, seems to be a completely different game from the game other people are playing. Controlling the randomness, thinking about opportunity cost, building a damage rotation, versus its isometric Dark Souls where you get upgrades as you go. It's just not when I play it. I'm not saying those people are wrong, just that the game offers enough range that I am essentially not playing the same game anymore. I'm not winning with the same talents, to put it a different way. So I think this is a really good starting point. This is why I was interested in this question, because when you look at it, build systems are kind of a weird fit for a lot of games. There aren't a lot of games where it super obviously makes a lot of sense. There's sort of a secondary element, and yet for it to feel like a game where you make builds a lot, you're trying to creep it into the primary parts of the game somehow. Just kind of ooze it over the primary gameplay loop. And I think this is surprisingly hard to do. When you look at it, a lot of the ways that you would show the player what they do and don't have, a lot of ways that you would encourage the player to get upgrades, complicate the idea that the game is providing like strict trade-offs. So, yeah, the idea that the player is encouraged to fill out the build isn't necessarily that good. I think that's an interesting point. Now, Seameister, you also said that you thought the Hades is 1 and 2 were a good fit. So let me read that. You said, I have yet to find another game besides the Hadeses 1 and 2 that cater perfectly to what you're describing, in my opinion. The game is designed so that you can strategically plan each attempt to your tastes, such as through your ability to adjust the difficulty, or simply go for an NPC that you want to talk to early in a run and then die and do something else. Likewise, I don't mind the repetitive nature of the exact gameplay loop, partly because there's dialogue and story, and build systems to provide variety elsewhere. Ooh, now, so this is another little wrench thrown into the mix. The idea that roguelike gameplay loops, semi-randomized arcade-style experiences, these fit build systems well because they provide variety to something that you repeat over and over again. Yeah, that's a pretty strong one. Now, again, there's an extent to which you could say, well, if these games give you enough agency that it feels like you can make a deliberate build, are they not then discouraging variety, which would be the benefit of that system? But Hades 1 and especially Hades 2, in my opinion, really do have pressure that lets you kind of move back in the opposite direction. So I'm going to talk about Hades 2 as an example. Hades 2 is in early access at the moment, but this system is not very much of a spoiler. It's only a mechanic, it's not part of the plot, and it's something that was in Hades 1, they just kind of fleshed it out more in Hades 2. So I hope that won't bother anyone who is trying to avoid materials about Hades 2. This is quite a game design specific thing. It's like only a spoiler in the absolute strictest possible sense. It's not to do with the plot. In Hades 1, between each of the floors of the underworld you're breaking out through, you get to pick or swap a keepsake. These are items you get from social interactions with other characters in the world, and they affect gameplay. So they might be things like, you get 150 gold, and then that's just once, you can swap it off next floor. You might have one that says, when your abilities don't have boons on them, you do way more damage until you remove this. So you could keep it on for a while or swap it off. But importantly, there are also keepsakes for each of the core Olympians that give you upgrades as you go. And if you equip that keepsake, you basically force that Olympian to appear in that floor of the run if possible, unless you somehow make it so no boons appear. Almost for certain, you will get, a Zeus boon if you equip Zeus's keepsake on this floor. This allows you to include certain Olympians when you want to, and means straightforwardly that you can force a build if you want it, run after run after run. Right? Well, it's not bad for the player to have control. If there's a reason that I want a Zeus boon in my build, it is desirable, I think, for the interest in making a build, to be able to say, hey, give me Zeus. How do we keep that benefit, but not just encourage the player to make the same build every single time? Or at least have our cake and eat it too a little. The players that want that can have it, and the players that don't have a reason to pursue variety. Hades 2 does something pretty smart. Now, Hades 1 has some things, as we already discussed. I mean, keeping a narrow range of gods is one thing, but then duo boons are pretty strong. So you're going to force one god, but then you might have others show up. And there's a more complicated thing in Hades 1, where simply seeing the Olympians that the run shows you before you force them into your run can save you chances to use keepsakes. But we won't get into that here. It's a little complicated. And to be fair, a pretty subtle aspect of Hades 1 that, again, I think is kind of more the game I was playing. But in Hades 2, the keepsakes have been overhauled around those Olympian keepsakes. Now, basically every keepsake provides a very powerful but consumable effect, really encouraging you to switch to a new keepsake every floor. The idea of some that you keep on and they give you a benefit until you remove them has been mostly done away with, which is a good fit because it competes with the Olympian keepsakes. If you would want to force a god into each floor of the run, well, you have like a 50% chance to see them anyway, and if you don't force them into the run, oh, the things you could have. Oh, the many benefits you could have. There are so many keepsakes that provide you great benefits right from the very start. Things like armor, giving you like overshields sort of on top of your health, or the thing I would use in Hades 1, which is the coin purse, is still back, and you can get so much money from starting effects in Hades 2 if you want it, and remain versatile and buy boons when you see ones you want. There's a lot more, and I won't get into them. But the point is, that now competes with a lot of other options. If you do insist on forcing an Olympian you want, I mean, you lose so many other benefits you could have. And hopefully the player will notice, it's not like you can't get, Zeus, for example. If you don't use Zeus's keepsake, you can still just get Zeus. Why not try another keepsake first? And if you don't get Zeus on the first floor, just use a keepsake then and get him in your run at that point. Could be okay. I think if the game pressured that just even a little bit more, that would be a good balance where you can absolutely, sort of assert your desire to determine what gods will be in your run. And if you want a single build every time, you can kind of pursue that in a coherent way. You have tools to make that happen, but not so many at the expense of any other options that it just makes no sense not to do that. I think in Hades 1, for a lot of players, there just wasn't enough of an incentive to do something else. So I think that this is a good point. What you're saying, Seameister, the idea that you can fill the, the sameness of repeating a run over and over again with a build system. But I think the trick is that you also have to make sure that you're allowing the player options, the ability to choose, without removing their interest or exposure to variety, finding a way to provide the variety when the player wants it, while still letting them kind of remove it when they don't want it. And again, this is one thing I think Hades 1 and 2 have done very, very well. There's enough pressure on what you get semi-randomly, but enough of a narrow range of what you can get, and enough control over what you can get, enough ways to re-roll or use god keepsakes, that you have a very carefully tuned balance of randomness and control. That I haven't really seen in a lot of other games like this. I don't think a lot of other roguelikes are trying to have a build system in the same way. They're sort of like, just see what path of build making what archetype you go into, rather than truly mixing and matching boons in a free-form, non-standard way each time, which I think happens in at least Hades 1 and so far in Hades 2. So yeah, an interesting point. I personally feel like the concern is that the player actually wants to pursue the variety that's there, while you've given them enough control that they can have a single build if they want it. To continue with this subject, iPatch notes asymptomatic on the streams. You continue with a part 2 of your comment. Enterprising players can also take advantage of systemic expectations or gaps in a system. While I do not have experience with Vampire Survivors itself, the 2024 game Twilight Survivors, okay, I haven't heard of that, but all right, follows rather closely. Both games have a finite inventory size. You can have 6 weapons and 6 passive items in Vampire Survivors, but also leave items in the level to pick up. And if you go get those, they can go over your inventory limit if it's full. Twilight Survivors has unique incentives for leveling up after the player has taken all of their upgrades. You over level. So does the player pick up an item right away so they can start over leveling faster, or do they reach the inventory limit before picking up the item to exceed the inventory cap? However, exceeding the inventory cap is not without risk because it pushes over leveling back. The player may not survive, is capitalized, to reach the new cap if they need another 5 or 6 levels. Vampire Survivors may or may not have this relationship. I'm making an educated guess without playing it. That system is kind of in Vampire Survivors. I personally don't think it is interesting in the same way, but the idea is really interesting. I might have to give that game a try because the idea of that mattering is cool. What's happening here is the game is saying, hey, if you don't keep getting new upgrades, if you just stick with what you have, or if you don't go get those items in the level that are the same every time, you can have more upgrades on top of this. You'll start getting like neutral levels after you're done upgrading all your weapons from leveling them up. And those will give you unique perks. But if you want to, you can go get these items in the level, either to fill your inventory up quickly so that you can start over leveling sooner, or because you want them on top of the normal items you can get, because you want the benefit of synergizing those items more than you want the over leveling benefits. I think this is good because it encourages the player to decide if they want like what type of build or another. If they just want to get more powerful, there's no need to keep going for more stuff. You can just level up and you'll get stronger. But if you want to create some big Mongo synergistic build, you have to pay a cost, but you can have more build space. This idea is fun in a lot of games where you can think of oh, well, if I get just more stuff, what if I want more mods on my build or whatever? What if you could just put them on, but you pay some kind of cost elsewhere? That's not a bad idea. And an interesting fit for these games where you get upgrades as you go. You know, Hades as well has a system where if you have an attack boon already, and you can only get one, and one is offered, you're allowed to swap and then you get a rarity boost for the new boon in exchange. You lose the old one, but you get a rarity boost. I don't think that that is usually a very good idea in Hades 1 and 2. Like, I would not often choose to do that personally. I don't think it's that, I guess, resource efficient. But it is an interesting form of that system, and the idea that, you know, if you just want damage, you don't have to go searching. The reason I think that's good is because it solves the problem of the player wanting to fill out their build. If they just want to get more powerful, there's a very simple thing they can do to get that. So they don't have to worry about getting a ton of stuff if they don't want it. But if they have a vision in mind for what the build will be like, okay, that's a different story. I'm really sold, iPatch Notes, with what you said about the UI being a big culprit, having there be literal slots open, influencing how the player feels. I think you're really right about that. I would predict, we have no way to know, that Hades 1 and 2 are presenting a lot of players with that impression that the game doesn't necessarily support in the rest of its design by having those open slots visible on the screen all the time. That's a good point. And to me, it connects back to this idea that while roguelikes might be a good fit for this kind of thing, if the player is just going to progress power, you know, another way to put it is, well, if it's going to get harder and you get upgrades as you go, the player wants to get stronger. And so they kind of always want to pick something, which might come at the point of, like, the build is just getting bloated instead of actually going further. So providing a kind of default or a way to power stuff up instead of just continuing to linearly add more boons to a build or whatever, more upgrades, more items in Vampire Survivors, Twilight Survivors, is a good idea. That kind of over-leveling mechanic. Now, I bet you it's just as an aside. To answer your question or implied question about Vampire Survivors, you can do the over-leveling thing. I would say my experience is that it is not a very sophisticated trade-off in Vampire Survivors, and over-leveling is lesser to having levels of items. Like, if there are items in the level and you can make your build have more stuff that you can level up more times, that's almost always better in my evaluation than over-leveling. The perks are just not strong or structured enough, in my opinion. But nobody knows all builds. Maybe that's like not true, or there have been more updates to Vampire Survivors that I haven't played. So I don't know if that has remained the case, but certainly when I played, I didn't think it was like an interesting choice to weigh the cost of, you know, picking an upgrade versus, you know, having a new leveling up, over leveling, and picking some perk. Usually it was better to get the items in the stage and get them after you get a full inventory as well. But the idea that that would be an interesting cost is pretty cool. You could even imagine items that are upgraded less, like there are less levels to the item. So when you get it in your inventory, it not only fills up your inventory slots, your basic slots, quicker, letting you overlevel quicker, it also just needs to be leveled up less times, perhaps, leading to you getting to the overleveling even faster, and at the expense of you having a lot of upgrades on your weapons. It's a cool idea. I like that. So certainly there are places where you can see, yeah, like that's where a need is filled. But what about a different perspective on approaching, you know, what kind of game is sort of asking for a build system to be put into it? Crew Parley Grandmaster Fruit says there are some beautiful examples of buildcraft in 4X strategy games and in tactical RPGs. 4X strategy games, the classic example being the Civilization series, are all about making tough decisions that build up on each other. A game about large-scale decisions is a prime target for good buildcraft. In comes Humankind, a game where you build your own culture on the path to modernity. You pick one out of the 10 to 14 cultures for each of the 6 eras of your civilization, giving you millions of different combinations. Each culture offers a passive perk, a unique unit, and a unique district. Benefits of those passive perks and districts can range from militaristic power to economic growth to utility that allows you to expand to new lands more easily. Some of these perks are short-term buffs, some only become valuable late game, others expand on perks and structure you already have synergistically. Over time, you use your choice of culture for each of the 6 years, your 30-ish binary choices for policies, your 5-ish religion perks, and a series of smaller event-like decisions to create a build capable of winning the game. And I would argue that this build crafting aspect is equally important to your success in the game as the turn-to-turn empire maintenance. Interesting. So this is a clever, different way to approach what kind of game is maybe looking for buildcraft in its gameplay loop by going sort of the opposite way. Well, what is fun about making builds? You can kind of feel like your options were a meaningful difference, or things build up on each other and you get to see the consequences a little bit. Let's look for games that just have that and then see which ones are doing something like making a build. Sure, very smart. That's an interesting idea. So this idea that as your civilization progresses, a little bit like you're doing a run in a roguelike, if you like, you pick perks throughout the run, but it's a civilization. And so the origins of that civilization may sort of have an effect down the line. You pick to have a society that, ate this staple crop in their early days. And so they have good cultivation techniques for that staple crop or something. And then later along the line, that pays off in some way when it's easier to make war rations out of that. I'm just completely making this up. This is not from any game. And so you get a payoff down the line. And maybe it's harder to have that staple crop at the beginning, but in era 4 or something, you will end up benefiting from having chosen that. So maybe you're a little weaker at the beginning. Era 2, you pick something that helps you now instead to stabilize and get to era 4 where you've already got something coming to pay off. That kind of thing. And you'd be able to experience and see that the way you played the game would be different. You could get stronger at certain times, weaker at certain times, kind of cash in that you're doing well or save yourself if you're doing poorly based on what's going on in the game. And it's also some playstyle expression. You could do it responsively, you just need this now, or you could do it sort of proactively. I just want to have this playstyle or perk. I like this unit or whatever, so I'm gonna pick that. Which, yes, I definitely think, what's that smell? That's for that fresh, hot buildcraft. Delicious. Clever idea. I like the idea that you sort of see the difference quickly, like that kind of thing. I felt like Baldur's Gate 3, a very unrelated game on the surface, had a really satisfying build making experience, even though it was a lot of respecking, I guess, and it didn't feel like I was seeing the consequences of that build. The system is designed in a way where I don't think it's very beneficial to keep the same build the whole playthrough, I guess. But it was interesting to see immediately the way that I can interact with the world has been altered because I changed my build in some way. And I think that was what was fun about it, is just on that tactical board, when you enter combat and you're doing your turn-based combat in Baldur's Gate 3, you see that your build's capabilities changed what you can do a lot. You made this machine that can now tackle combat in a new way, and you really notice that. Kind of what I was saying about Cyberpunk, like I didn't really like hacking and melee so much, but you really noticed the impact. You get to experience, you chose that build and now here's like the effect. It's very direct. Whereas sometimes in games like Hades and Vampire Survivors, it doesn't feel like the game has actually changed that much by your decisions. You just kind of make a different math device to destroy the enemies. Fun in its own way, its own kind of fun. But it is kind of interesting to look at this and say, well, in what type of game does your build make the biggest visual impact? Things look, progress, feel different. This doesn't totally work in Baldur's Gate 3, but just as another example, if you dump charisma, people are constantly getting pissed off at you as you say something insensitive. The game has been structured in such a way where that, is a problem often enough that you would kind of notice, like people just don't like you that much. You're not that likable. You're more inclined to maybe rough them up a little bit. So yeah, I like this idea. I think it's cool that the consequences of making a certain build decision earlier can now be seen sort of trickling up in a much more direct way than you can in something like Hades, for example. You picked this core boon, yeah, that opened up certain boon options. It did, but in a kind of quiet way. I think one great thing about these two is, remember, a lot of my criticism of Hades as an example here is that I think a lot of the good opportunity cost is just very quiet. Like a lot of players might just not notice. Whereas here, I haven't played Civilization. I've watched people play Civilization, but it sounds fairly obvious. You know what I mean? Like, of course your perk here is going to have an effect down the line. That's like the whole game. Whereas maybe in Hades, people are distracted from that in some way. Pretty interesting idea, yeah. As for the tactical RPGs, Grandmaster Food continues, there are 3 classics of Fire Emblem, XCOM, and the Final Fantasy Tactics games. But recently there have been tons of smaller games in the genre. 3 that come to mind are Unicorn Overlord, Triangle Strategy. Is that a real game? I thought that was a joke. I saw that in a video one time and didn't know that was real. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And the excellent Lost Eidolons. The final one will be my example. Missions in Lost Eidolons are tough, as you can only bring 10 units per mission for the entirety of the game. You have to balance frontline, archers, damage, mages, healers, utility mages, and everything in between, all with only those 10 slots, I see. Depending on how you promote your units, you'll have different combinations of units available. You have limited items that have to be distributed among your troops, and mages have different spells they can bring to the field. Once again, I'd argue that the short and long-term team building are an equally important part of the gameplay as the moment-to-moment tactics. Yeah, it's certainly a game where, and Mr. Fruit, your whole thesis here has been, these are games where the builds are very important. It's very critical to your success, what your build is, but also you can really see the effects of those things. You have very few options, and so if you pick to not bring like a utility mage or whatever, I'm imagining that would be pretty noticeable. You know, you can't counter these effects to kind of brute force through those things. In a very simple way, playing something like Arknights, there's been a real obsession with invisible enemies lately in Arknights events, and so you really notice the mission is completely different in terms of challenge if you bring a unit that reveals invisibility. As it's kind of a separate issue, I don't really think this is a good thing in Arknights. There's not that many invisibility revealers, and they're all already pretty strong, except for like a few that are just sort of the only option to reveal invisibility in a certain way. So it's I don't know if that's good overall, but it's certainly a game where if they balance those mechanics better, it's very noticeable if you lack one or not. And your placement of a unit is important just as it is to have picked tools that will lead you to success in that fight. So I can imagine how this would be a similar situation. Yeah, I think a problem I had with Fire Emblem Three Houses was that, like a lot of games where you kind of make a build as you go, it felt like if I had a plan for my build, if I looked stuff up basically, and I trained my students, is what you do in Three Houses. If I taught my students things early on, planning for what it would be like later, that made me so much more powerful than the game reasonably expected, that the game kind of didn't work after a certain point, or I had to turn up the difficulty, or then that difficulty felt kind of not what I was interested in. There wasn't really a difficulty that expected me to plan, I guess is the issue. And that's what I'm going to say about all of these, really. I think the underlying problem that we can see as a pattern here is that if the player doesn't have a plan, then it's kind of difficult for these systems to be totally balanced, or not just encourage you to, you have things like the Civilization series where it sounds like it's pretty obvious that what you pick builds up on itself. So in those games, you would imagine that the player basically needs to have some kind of plan, or they won't do very well. They could pick responsive perks. Maybe this isn't true, it's just what I'm imagining. And certainly in Fire Emblem Three Houses, like planning your unit's training over the course of the story is a pretty noticeable benefit. They can barely even get to the heights that they can possibly obtain, their cap in how good they can be at archery or whatever, even if you train them in it every single day until the end of the game. And so if you don't plan that out, you quite noticeably lose out on powerful perks down the line. Likewise, in Hades, you might not notice the benefit or the balance of some of these forms of opportunity cost if you have no plan for your build. If you just try to get good boons as you go, the game will seem like it just gives you, you fill out boons for your core boons, and then you have these extra things in the background, whatever. When in fact the game supports and rewards you playing where you plan out from the start, okay, well, I have this boon, so I'm not going to go for boons for these slots because I've already got something planned there, and I'll try to build it up by looking through the in-game boon browser and finding something that, benefits the boon I already have, rather than a new way to do a powerful attack that overlaps with what I'm already doing. But these games are not very much like about that planning, I guess is how I feel. Well, the Civilization games may very well be, but certainly when I played Fire Emblem Three Houses, or in Hades and Hades 2's design, or Vampire Survivors design, it benefits you tremendously to have a plan for how, your build will grow over the run, or how your students will grow over time. but the game doesn't really do anything in its design that like helps you have a plan or know how beneficial it would be, for your plan to play out. Occasionally in Three Houses, there'll be a plot thing where a student is missing or turns on you or something, and then you don't have the unit that you invested a lot of that training into as well. And so, I mean, they're not going to tell you that as a plot spoiler, but then it can make it a little tricky for planning. Or if you do plan out your build, you'll probably see that spoiler when you're looking on the wiki or whatever. So that's kind of a in Hades. I think for a lot of people, it's not even clear that they could deliberately seek out like a standard progression of boons that they planned that they want, or make one up on the fly. I think, again, this is a case where you want design more like Limbus Company, where the game shows you a detailed account of what your team will be able to do. Exactly how many of each sin resource can your team build by using their abilities, what ability is it, what egos are taking those resources, and then if they went a little bit further and added, please add something that lets me flag what egos I actually care about, it would be so good. It's a piece of design that helps you do the planning you'll wish you'd done once you get to the gameplay. And that's the thing that I feel like is missing from a lot of, I haven't played all of these games, systems. They heavily reward a type of behavior that the game has absolutely nothing to support your ability to do, or next to nothing. You can look up the boons that exist in Hades and it will tell you prerequisites, but that's like hidden in a menu, and it's not eminently obvious that that would be beneficial. I feel like for many of these games, that is one of the better parts of the game. Looking at Hades, a lot of complaints had to do with lacking agency when designing a build, which it doesn't exist. I mean, you can apply agency when making a build, but those players didn't know. And the game doesn't do anything to make it obvious. So, I mean, why not have a throwaway line from one of the gods that says, hey, if you keep picking different gods, there aren't going to be more showing up during this run. The other Olympians will think you've got enough help and go keep fighting on the front lines. And then the game could do a little pop-up that says, you have 3 out of 4 Olympians for this run or whatever. And that would just make it a bit more obvious that you can pick and choose. That system does exist in Hades. The game just doesn't tell you it exists in any way. It has a massive impact on the effectiveness of your run, but the game just doesn't tell you that it does. You have to just notice on your own or be told. And I think that is bad. I think it directly addresses many of the complaints a lot of players have about these games. And so the argument we're building up is, no, build systems are a good fit for Hades, let's say, but not necessarily the way the game presents those build systems. That is still what's lacking. The pairing of this gameplay build system is really, really good, but the presentation of that build system, that is still the weaker link, perhaps. Whereas in some of these games, it might be a lot better. The Civilization series maybe just implies enough that you're going to plan as you go, that it becomes obvious to a lot of players in context that, of course, you're going to have to, structure out what you're doing. And so you immediately wonder, hey, if I pick this perk, at Civilization Era 1 or whatever, does that limit what I can pick down the line? In fact, I have no idea, but I bet some of games like that even have an interface that visually shows you, hey, if you pick this now, you can't pick this in Era 3 or whatever. That is imaginable. So that kind of thing would certainly help. And there are kind of examples of that in other games I can think of. Again, in the Fire Emblem Three Houses run that I did, I really noticed how some students were bad at things, but had it's called a budding talent. Basically, if you push on that subject, you don't get a reward now, but if you work at it for hard enough, they become kind of good at it and it opens up a new direction. Often it would be like for students with magic, just to give people something more concrete to hold on to. It would be like this student that likes using a spear and fighting on horseback can become good at magic, but is naturally pretty bad at it. So if you splash it a little, it doesn't really go anywhere. But if you dedicate it to your tutoring them in magic every single, session or whatever, they eventually turn that weakness into a strength, and you can build them in this kind of unusual way. Maybe because they have a perk or something that you want to synergize with magic doing, but they're not natively very good at it. And so you can choose to invest in that or do it in a more straightforward way. The game gives you an easy way to just make them stronger at the straightforward thing they're good at, or if you want to, you can do your own thing with various different kind of strengths and weaknesses from each student along the way. sort of a little bit gestures at the idea that you would plan. You know what I mean? The idea that there are budding talents, that there are these things that you've got to work at to make the character better later, puts the player in a mindset indirectly where they think, well, for that to be any good, I inherently have to think about how my squad will be doing, in 3 months on the calendar. And so, do I want that? Do I want to work toward that and then just figure out what to do in the meantime? Or do I need him to be better with the spear now for the dragon we're going to fight this weekend or whatever? I don't know. Fire Emblem Three Houses, right? And so I feel like that system gestures at the idea of planning. Let's go one step further to round out the Crew Parley today and say, well, we'll pull the True Parley Grandmaster Food thing. 4X strategy games like the Civilization series, well, these might be good fits for good buildcraft because they are games about tough decisions that build up on each other. They're games where you would see the consequences of making your decisions. And so that could be a good fit. Rather than saying what games have design space open for you to put a build system in, let's look at what games suggest planning out a build. And then let's put a build in there. What games already quietly suggest doing that kind of thing? And then you could add in a build in some way. I don't immediately have any specific idea. I mean, it's weird because there's examples like Baldur's Gate 3 where, yeah, you build up over time what character you have, but it's so easy to respec, and it kind of needs to be easy to respec because there's no way players are going to plan a build over the 6 months on average or something insane like that players will play this game. So again, it's a game that rewards planning, but does it really make it visible what you're getting over time? Nah, not really. Not really. I certainly went Wiki Warrior pretty hard on that. Let's see, what else? Well, the Finals comes to mind. The Finals is a destructible environment, small team, first-person shooter, where you get to pick a few gadgets, and then you can have a few in reserve. And the idea is that these can be swapped into your build mid-match. So just to give you an example, I have a build I often use when I play, or a loadout, I guess, I often use when I play 5v5, control the point. You have to get on a moving platform. The more of your team on the platform, the faster it moves in your team's direction. Whoever's team has got it on their side or further at the end wins. And it's really effective to, reinforce the platform somehow. So at the beginning of the match, I have my signature ability is a turret, the medium ability to put down a turret. And medium class has a gadget that is an APS, so it destroys incoming explosives or projectiles. If someone throws a grenade at my objective or my turret, this device will destroy it until it's shot manually with guns. It will destroy ordnance, explosives. So beginning of the match, I grab those and a zip line so that I can provide a movement tool for my party. I, run with the rest of the randomly matched players on the team, but then when we get to a point where we can't go straight toward the objective, I put down a zip line and hopefully some of them will use it and get to the objective faster. Now the zip lines do stay in the environment if I keep a zip line in my loadout, but once the match starts, we're not all alive at the same time. So I'll swap it out for jump pad. So I have really good mobility, I think often better mobility than zipline will give you, or the kind of mobility I want. But it doesn't benefit my teammates in the same way, which is a little okay because they're not going to be in the same place anyway. I'll swap my APS out for a grenade or something, or a glitch trap that destroys and disables enemy devices like enemy APS turrets, if the enemy takes the point. No point getting something to reinforce the point if we're not even close to getting back on the point. Might as well just bring some grenades, something like that. So you can swap them in. And the fact that the game gives you that option, and you kind of know there's more things than what you'd want, makes it easy to think, oh, I should plan out, what other gadgets might I want later down the line. Or there's someone spamming mines, let me get the data reshaper to turn the mines into harmless prop objects. But if there isn't someone using that, this item isn't that good. So what do? Well, I just put it in the back line. I swap it into my kit if I need it, and if nobody appears dropping a ton of mines, no problem, I'll just leave it in there. But I have it if I need it to counter that player. I think this is a good model for this kind of thing. you can make decisions about what things you want to bring along, and then you really notice the moment where it happens. You respawn pretty quick, you've swapped in that gadget, and then you use it and counter the player, and it feels like you get a direct, noticeable feedback. While if you get killed by that player, hopefully it's reasonably obvious that you could equip the gadgets that countered the thing that killed you, and then you would have a better time next time. So the game does at least, like I was saying with the idea of, the Civilization games or with Fire Emblem Three Houses, it gestures at the idea that you would want to plan, but I'm not sure that that goes the full mile and is actually a game that shows you planning. I'm trying to think what would be a better example of this. We can make up game design too. Let's do that a little bit. So an example for me would be, what about a game where you need to make future generations stronger by doing things in this life? You pass on a magic crest to your ancestors, and that will have powerful spells in it if you get hit by powerful spells. You have to survive long enough through your roguelike, I don't know, run, and then die to a powerful piece of magic, which is then imprinted on your clan's crest. Your predecessors, your ancestors, the people that come after, I can't do this right now, will have that ability. And so you inherently want to plan, oh, if I die to this, I know I'm going to get that ability in the future. And since that's the premise of the game, from the start, you're thinking, well, if I take an ability, maybe my ancestors will have that. I can't say the word that is the people that come after you when you die. I don't know why. You get it. Will have these abilities, but also I want to get further in the run, so I die to a powerful spell, so they'll have that in the next, the next run I play. You could then have them get your build, but plus a really powerful spell that maybe you want to synergize around a little differently. And so that would be a game where inherently you're, again, kind of gesturing at, hey, plan this out. Also making a build as you go, if it's a roguelike or something. But then you get a kind of twist at the end. You got this spell from before, and so now maybe you want a really powerful spell to combo with it. And you can imagine progression in this game where you've got a cool build one run, almost like Hades at first. You die to some cool attack. You've got those abilities plus the attack you died to in your build next time. And now you could try to build a build that synergized around the powerful spell you got and get a powerful one next time. And after a little while, the player will go, what if I made a build that is all synergizing powerful spells I died to? What if those spells are stronger than anything the player achieves on their own? And therefore, the kind of ultimate build is to create a whole build out of spells that killed you, these super powerful game pieces that synergize, but it's hard because you have to survive long enough to encounter someone who will use that spell against you at the same time. I think that sounds pretty cool. And you can see how the game's structure sort of implicitly guides the player through having a master plan. This, to me, is a natural progression of roguelikes in general, which I think are popular for a lot of people because they're not looking to make a build, like we're talking about in this parlay. They're instead looking for a build to simply happen. They think it's cool to see a build in action, but they don't have an idea for a build, and roguelikes, some of them anyway, provide the service of kind of causing one to occur, without them having a build idea in the first place. I would go one step further. I would propose that a lot of these players actually want to make builds, and it's more that they don't like the process, or they don't think they would like the process. They don't have time, or they don't think they have time to make a build in the sort of planning it out ahead of time. So rather than making a game that allows the player the agency to plan ahead, if they do think to do it, if they're the kind of person who wants to go on the wiki and plan out their whole build, then they can do it. I would almost rather have a game where the player learns to do that kind of thing throughout the process. And for the player that wants control, well, I think it works too. You're kind of fighting for control over the randomness in the run. That you could expand upon that in a lot of game mechanics. Get spells that control the randomness in the run, that let a spell that lets you re-roll, something like that. I think it sounds like a cool idea, but I think you get my overall point to the prompt, the idea that there are some types of gameplay that kind of feed better into, making builds or fit making builds better. Certainly there are some straightforward answers. Roguelikes, 4X, strategy games, tactical RPGs. Yeah, like these are games that the structure of the game naturally allows room for a build. And maybe even the 4X strategy games kind of gesture at the idea that you would plan out a build. But to me, going one step further, it would be a game that is about planning out a build. That isn't doesn't just feature that or gesture at that, but is about that. The thing you do is you're making builds constantly. And that was what I liked in a lot of these. Like in Hades, for example, in a lot of roguelikes, you play the build in progress as you go along. In Civilization, your choices at a lower, tier of play affect what happens down the line. And so you're encouraged to make a build that is thinking about all stages of play, which I think is a one type of experience, but certainly a way to get the player thinking about what is the whole build gonna be. It kind of invites the player in to plan that out a little, or benefits them if they do it. Again, there is a concern that it might be just too valuable to plan that out. You basically just can't play unless you sit down and like do a thing about it. Again, I don't know. I haven't played Civilization, but I think that is the case with some games. It might be fun if you're willing to take the time to set up a build, but the game isn't really structured to decide what to do if you don't do that. Again, when I've played D&D with my playgroups, something I've been playing around with is the level 0 opening. The player starts not as a player character. No background. I just tell my players, look up some races, some species that you want to play as, and come with a list of those. When the players arrive, I show them a battle map of a village or a port town or something, and a stack of index cards. On the stack of index cards are basic stats and a few items possessed by every single person who lives in this settlement. A small village with 20 people or whatever, the adults mostly, and here's the stack of cards of their basic stats and a few items they have. When a player wants to get started, they simply draw an index card and embody that person in the settlement. There you go. Who are they? What's their story? Well, on the card it says this is a milkmaid. Here are their stats. They have high strength. Maybe you do something with that. And what race is this person? What species is this character? And they say, from my list of species that I was interested in, Dragonborn. They're a Dragonborn milkmaid. Cool, neat. And they're super jacked from milking the cows in the morning, and I'm working on that Dragonborn bod. I don't know. Players draw their characters, or maybe they need a new option to explore a strange disturbance in the town, and they draw another character and can swap between available NPCs that have been established. Well, they're basically player characters now. You can see where this is going. Something bad happens in the town, and like everybody dies, but they can switch between and draw more people in the village to try to find a way to get these unskilled commoners to defeat the eldritch horror that has appeared in the middle of town. And while most of them will hopefully die, Game Master, make sure most of them die. It's not too hard. You can overtune the encounter a lot. Some of them will survive, or maybe even run away. I would say let the players run away if they try multiple times, or if they don't try it first, but then they decide they're in over their head. It seems like an okay type of encounter to say, it is a dramatic ending for the players to run away from their village and their 6 fellow villagers that just died. It's a great conclusion for the players to just flee eventually. And the survivors are their player character options. They choose one of them. After all, they picked what race the character is, and they got to swap around and pick between some backgrounds. And something already happened to the character because, well, their backstory just happened. You just played it. And now all they have to do is choose a class, or simply encounter a class opportunity down the road. You get on the nearest caravan and head to a major city to ask for help. And along the way, a mysterious figure perching against a tree says, hey, you really, you survived against that demon back there. The player character says, what's this about? How do you know about that? And this is a warlock patron, of course, that can sign your character aboard and make you acquire a class, warlock, during gameplay. How did you become a warlock? Why did you pick to be a warlock? If you don't have answers to these questions, it just happens to you, and the game just works, and it's fine. As these things occur, the player begins to think, well, I want to make my own history. I kind of made some of these points of history, and I want to make my own. Or a little thing I do to get a little more technical in the everyone is dying stage is I let players, if a player rolls and they can't quite do something, they're an unskilled commoner, I say, well, you get a few tokens to add a little bit of a stat boost to your character, basically building the character on the fly, but you have to commit it now, and I'll let you respec it eventually, but it will take some work. So the character remembers, yeah, my milkmaid dragonborn got super jacked when her adrenaline fully manifested itself and she threw the barn door off of her and her spouse, and that's why I have that high strength. I made this story for this character, kind of, you know what I mean? It was like on training wheels a little, but you sort of did. And of course, for the player that wants to make a build deliberately, this is a whole new kind of fun. You have a plan for what character you want, and my system allows you to achieve the same stat spread that you'd normally have at level 1, the same character options, that's the same. But you do have to survive with an unskilled commoner while you set that build up. Do you want your build to be 16 in charisma? Well, you better find a way for your unskilled commoner to survive while you spend your tokens that let you override a bad roll on charisma only. I hope no physical misfortune befalls you, and if you manage to do that, great. If you don't, well, I'll still let you respec later. Again, it just takes some work. You remember that you took that dexterity because you were gonna die if you didn't take that dexterity. For me, this has been very effective. I don't want to talk it up too much. I have a sample size of like 5 people, but when I've ran this with 2 groups now, they liked it very much. And I think part of the reason it works well is that it's a new type of fun if you want to make a build. Your build mattering starts earlier. If you have a build in mind, at level 1 in D&D, I mean, you pick your first class that you planned out and you wait for your features to be online, you know what I mean? In this version, it's already a challenge. You have to actively pursue getting that build to work. And your first class was going to be, what's that? You want to be a fighter for your first level? Well, you need to go become a fighter in play. You need to like role play gaining the abilities of the fighter class at level 1 in some way. And so it gives you something to do and engage with while your build takes shape, while giving you all the same agency. Whereas if the player doesn't have those ideas, the game is about those things happening to the player. So you don't have to worry about the player like not thinking to plan them out. The player, you can even hear your players saying, wow, that was messed up. I got to train and become stronger. It's like, yeah, because it's about leveling up and your adventure as, heroes or whatever, vagabonds at this point. And I have found that to be effective. The game is sort of more about the planning rather than just the game that gestures at the planning. You actually play the planning actively. The drama in the game is the moments where you make planned or you decide on the fly to plan character decisions. To me, that has been the kind of ultimate so far. And I am not at all trying to brag. I want more games like this. That is my design idea. I'm very excited about this. I promise I did not ask this question just to rant about this subject. I actually thought of this in the month intervening between when I asked this and when I didn't. And your ideas made me think, oh yeah, that totally does work, doesn't it? Because that's the problem for a lot of games, I think. It's that they don't gesture at the idea of planning as you go, or the game's structure does fit a build, but doesn't necessarily gesture at or encourage like thinking about builds. Again, a roguelike, you kind of feel like you have to find more powerful things to keep up with the run. But Hades is mostly about not being able to pick something that directly increases your build's power, or needing to like figure that out as you go. It's not a terrible idea, but again, the game kind of doesn't show you that it's going to be about that. It suggests just fill the space, but actually it rewards a very different kind of behavior. Having the game suggest the build crafting foresight that it actually rewards is, I think, my big problem here. And so that's why maybe I should play Civilization. I feel like that sounds cool. I hope this was fun. I enjoyed this first one. Wow, almost an hour on the dot, too. I didn't particularly plan that. I will say, obviously, since only 3 people responded, these will often be longer. I do want to say, looking at the one from this past month, I'm happy to see people responding. That's not bad. Respond at length if you want. Just be aware that if people respond as long as I can see some of you did for September, I may need to not read every single thing. It might just be impossible to make this in like an hour and a half. It's okay if it goes longer than an hour, but just as a heads up. It's perfectly fine to write a lot. I think that's cool. That's fun. Just keep in mind that we have to fit everybody in. If you want to respond to someone's thing that they said too, that's also totally fine. We're going to have to work out the kinks in this format as we go, but let's just not worry about it. It's fun. Let's just stick to it. Talk to you soon. Looking forward to the next one. If you want to participate in these, check the link in the description. See you next time.